Okay, we're going to be in Hebrews chapter 4, so if you got a Bible, you can go ahead and turn there. If you got our app, you can go ahead and open the notes. There's a lot of notes in there, 2,500 words or so. We probably won't cover most of them, but you've got everything I studied is right there for you. The main purpose of Hebrews is to show you the complete work of Christ. It's not just about the cross. It's not just about the resurrection. It's not just about the ascension. It's about all of it. Amen? All of it fits in. So the whole purpose of Hebrews is it's a sermon by the Apostle Paul, this is my view anyway, where he's preaching to Jewish followers of Jesus who are very tempted to walk away from Jesus and go back to Judaism. And the sermon is trying to explain to them, here's what Jesus did, this is what Jesus is doing now, like present tense, and these are all the reasons why you don't need to walk away from him. That's what the whole point of Hebrews is about. So we've been walking through this. If we look at our little map here, we're in between these two sections here, Moses and the land and the priest and Melchizedek. We'll explain that in a minute. We'll start to explain it. How about that? So we're in this section where basically the whole point of Hebrews is to try to show you that Jesus the Messiah is better than everything else you've ever thought about. Right, so he's better than Moses. He's better than where he's taking us is better than the promised land. He's better than the priesthood. He's better than even Melchizedek, who's this big mysterious person in the Old Testament. He's better than the sacrifices. He's better than the covenant because he's the one who brings the new covenant. Right, so he's trying to show these Jewish listeners, if you walk away from Jesus, you walk away from everything that's better. Right? You're just going back to not as good as, basically. So we're in this section where he's going to start talking about the priesthood now, and that's where we're going to head in just a few minutes. So he's been setting up the Moses and the land thing. Israel, they were saved from Egypt, and then they chose not to go into the land, so they wandered for 40 years, and their children, the next generation, got to go in. So he's using that whole story to talk about how Jesus is trying to bring us to a resting place. He's trying to bring us into a new promised land. Don't be like Israel, who worked really hard and all that to get there and then decided not to go in. They gave up at the last minute kind of thing. So he's saying don't be like them. So now that he set all that up, he's going to turn to the priesthood and start talking about Melchizedek and all that stuff. And some of you who've never read Hebrews are like, who is Melchizedek? Or what is a Melchizedek? Well, what are we talking about? We'll get there. Actually, we're going to get there for like the rest of the month. We're going to be talking about priest and Melchizedek. So might as well get used to it. So let me go ahead and set this up for you. I need to set up the problem before we start addressing the problem. So here's kind of the context. First century Jewish Christians, Jewish disciples, we're asking this question. If we follow Jesus, if we keep following Jesus, well, what about the temple and the priesthood and the sacrifices and the high priest and all that stuff that's still going on down there in Jerusalem at the time that this sermon was preached, right? So sometimes we forget this because we're reading 2,000 years into the future. So I want you to go back in time to the first century. Jesus has already died and been resurrected and ascended, and it's been about 30 years. Okay, got that in your head? All right, the temple in Jerusalem still standing. There's still sacrifices going on. There's still a high priest. Got that in your head? Okay. And you become a Christian. You were a Jewish person. You've been raised in that whole system your whole life. And now you've come to believe that Jesus is the Jewish Messiah. He's the Messiah. He's the Savior of the world, and I want to follow him. And you start doing that. And it would be inevitable for the question to arise in your mind, what do I do about the temple stuff? If I'm following Jesus, does that mean I don't go to the temple anymore? Or do I still go to the temple and do the Jesus thing? How does this work? Do you see how that would be confusing? Right? The book of Hebrews, or the sermon of Hebrews, is addressing that. He's trying to tell you, look, we're in this time of transition. But that doesn't mean the old covenant is worthless, and it doesn't mean that the temple and the priesthood is worthless. It just means that something better has arrived. Make sense? Okay, So let me set it up this way by going to Hebrews 8, and then I promise we'll start with the passage we're supposed to cover. So Hebrews 8, he says, in speaking of a new covenant, because he previous to this was talking about the new covenant. Actually, in the Greek text, it just says, in speaking of a chiron, or a new. In speaking of a new, he makes the first covenant, obsolete. And the word there for obsolete means useless or worn out. It has been worn out. It's got its usefulness. Make sense? And then he says, and what is becoming obsolete is growing old and ready to vanish away. What does he mean by all that? He's talking about the old covenant, right? The Torah covenant with Israel. And what he's getting at here, and there's a lot of Greek stuff going on here that I won't bore you with. What he's saying is we're in this time of transition. The temple's still standing. The high priest is still doing his job. The priesthood's still there. The sacrifices are still going. But Jesus has already done everything he's doing, and he's already ascended, and then now there's a new covenant in operation, but the old one is still operating. So do you see the problem for the Jewish believer? What do I do with that? Do I stop going there and only do the Jesus thing, or how does this work? So the argument that he's trying to make in Hebrews is, if you leave Jesus and go back to the old covenant, you're going back to something that's about to be gone. Because the moment these words were spoken, the temple was still there. But in just a few years, all that's going to be destroyed. So now do you see why he's doing the sermon the way he's doing it? Because all the apostles knew, because Jesus taught them in Matthew 24, Mark 13, and Luke 21, that the temple's coming down. That whole thing's gone, right? They all knew that. So one of the things that Paul's trying to do in this sermon is he's trying to say, that's going away. So don't go back, because that's like seriously going away in just a few years, right? So if you go backwards, you might get caught up in that, and you might go away with it. Am I making sense? Because if you go back to Judaism and you go back to Jerusalem and all that war starts up, you're going to get caught in the crossfire. So we got to think historically about this, right? Okay, so one thing's passing away, another thing is coming. So the time of transition, the Jerusalem temple still standing and operating. Hebrews is trying to say that God's temple and high priest is in heaven now, not in Jerusalem. That makes sense? So then the question becomes, I hope all this makes sense at some point. Then the question is, how can Jesus be a priest? He's not qualified. Now, as soon as I say that, you think, well, of course he's qualified. He's Jesus. Well, that's because you don't know your Bible. In the Torah, you have to be a descendant of Aaron to be the high priest. And you have to be a Levite from the tribe of Levi, to be a priest at all. Jesus is not from the tribe of Levi. He's not a descendant of Aaron. He's from the tribe of Judah. So as soon as, if you can remember, just go back, you're in the first century in the church Paul was preaching this in. Remember? Temple's still standing in Jerusalem, and you're wondering how all this works. Okay. What he's trying to do is say, Jesus is your high priest now, and he knows his audience is going to go, how? He's not from Aaron or Levi. He's from Judah. How could he be a priest? Because Paul's audience knows their Bible. That's the problem that we're about to address now. Now that I've confused everybody, let's see if I can make it worse. Verse 14. Since then we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God. Let us hold fast to our confession. Okay, so here's what he just did. He says, since then. That's a statement of fact. He's saying, in fact, we do have a great high priest. And our high priest didn't just pass through a curtain in a tent on earth. Are you with me? Our high priest passed through the heavens. He went through like a super curtain into the super holy of holies. Am I making sense now? The reason why we need to set this up tonight is because for the next several weeks, we're going to be talking about that heavenly tabernacle and in the mercy seat that Jesus went and offered himself to, and all this is going to get weird, so we got to deal with it now. Now, here's something cool that I learned like 2 hours before y'all got here. The phrase great high priest was the common phrase in the Jewish world of the time for the current high priest. Let me explain. In the Gospel of John, in the Gospels in general, but especially in John, they go to two different high priest houses. I don't know if you ever noticed this. When we went through the Gospel of John, we talked about it some, but he goes to one guy's house, who's the high priest, it says, and then he goes to another guy's house, and it says, for he was the high priest that year. And you're like, what? I thought the last guy's house was the high priest, but what's going on is that the guy who retired is still referred to as high priest, but the great high priest is the one in charge right now. Does that make sense? It's like when we call like President Bush, we still call him Mr. President, but he's not the president anymore. But he was, so we still refer to him by that title. Great high priest, I could be wrong about all this, but I don't think I am. I think what Paul was doing is trying to let them know that the guy in Jerusalem at that time who called himself a high priest was no longer the high priest. That Christ in heaven's tabernacle at the throne of God is the great current high priest. He's the one in charge now, not the one in Jerusalem. Am I making sense? In just a minute, he's going to start talking about the guy in Jerusalem and how he's inferior. Okay, so we have a great high priest who didn't just pass through a curtain into the Holy of Holies once a year on the Day of Atonement. Our high priest has passed through the heavens, through the cloud curtain, and he's went directly into the actual throne of God. Remember, the tabernacle is like a copy. It's a prototype. So when Moses is on the mountain in Mount Sinai, God tells him, I want you to build the tabernacle according to the pattern I'm going to show you. If you read later in Hebrews, he tells you God showed him the heavenly tabernacle and says, build a version of that. That's what tabernacle is. It's basically heaven on earth, mobile. I like the idea that it's mobile, which should play into when David's like really wanting to build God a house. What does God say? Why do I need that? I can go anywhere. I got a tent. I'm a camping God, right? I can go anywhere you go. I can be with you anywhere. We want to build you a spot right here in our little nation. Well, I didn't ask you to do that, right? But he lets them do it. But what he's getting at here is he's saying, look, our high priest passed into the real thing. Not the prototype, not the symbolic version of it called the tabernacle. He went to the real throne of God, into the real presence of God. That automatically makes him better. Right? So he says he's passed through the heaven, Jesus, Son of God. So let us hold fast our confession. Remember, that was all in chapter 3 and 4. Hold fast till the end, all that stuff. For we do not have a high priest. Now, this is the good part. If you fell asleep, this is a good time to wake up. But we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses. Just think about that for a second. Paul just told us part of the purpose of Jesus' human life is so he could prove to us that he is able to sympathize with our weakness. Think about that for a minute. Jesus left heaven. The Word of God, Son of God, leaves heaven, becomes a human so that he could experience everything we experience, including temptation. So that when he comes and says, I want to be your priest, we could trust him knowing that he's walked in our steps. He's been in our shoes. So when I come to him and say this temptation is really rough, he knows. It's not like he's just God so he knows. He knows that because he's been in skin before. And he knows what it feels like for your flesh to pull you in that direction. He's experienced that. He just never gave into it, right? Because he's been in every respect tempted as we are, yet without sin. He never had a blemish. He's an unblemished sacrifice. He's the Lamb of God, right, who takes away the sin of the world. He never sinned, but he certainly faced temptation. And he certainly faced suffering. He certainly stubbed his toe in the middle of the night, and it hurt. He knew what it was like to be hungry and alone and to be emotionally distraught. He knew what it was like to be tired. I like this part. He knew what it was like to just need to get away from people. You ever notice how the Gospels tend to highlight that? And Jesus left everyone and went to a solitary place to pray. That's, okay, I'll translate it for you, the Kurt edition. Jesus had enough of people and needed some time alone. Yeah. He came here and he experienced everything, and we often wonder, why did he do it that way? Paul's trying to tell us he did that so you would trust him. That he's been there, he's done it, he gets it, right? Isn't this religion just so beautiful? What other God does this? Goes and gets in skin, becomes one of us, lets us kill him so he could show us how much he loves us. There's not another religion that does that. Trust me, I looked into it. It's not out there. Let us then with confidence, literally boldness, draw near to the throne of grace. That is about as Leviticus as you could word it. That we may receive mercy and find grace to help in time of need. So I said that was real Leviticus, so let me explain. Anytime you read draw near, you should be thinking Leviticus. Anytime you read draw near in the New Testament, which was written by Jews, when they write the word draw near, which was in a different language, but you know what I mean, they're thinking Leviticus. Why? Because the book of Leviticus itself is about drawing near. You with me? Why is there even a tabernacle to begin with? Because God wants to be near us. And he wants us to be near him. Right? So the whole book of, by the way, if you read the end of Exodus, I think I put this in your notes somewhere, unless that was on another sermon I was working on 2 days ago. I don't remember. But I think I put it in there. At the end of Exodus, you'll see that they build the tabernacle, they dedicate it, and the presence of God fills it. And then it says, but Moses could not enter. Well, what was the point of all this? Right? That's how you're supposed to read the end of Exodus. You're supposed to read that last paragraph and go, well, that's bad. They did all this work. I had to read all these plans of the tabernacle twice. Because you read the plans, and then he says, and then Moses, and it tells you that he did all the plans in detail. You read them all twice. You get to the end of the book, and he can't even go in there. The end. But if you flip to Leviticus, and it says, then Yahweh called to Moses from the tent of meeting, meaning he's still outside of it. The book of Leviticus is, here's how you can draw near safely. At the end of Leviticus, beginning of Numbers, the Lord is speaking to Moses in the tent, not from it. Make sense? We're supposed to notice that, but nobody ever taught us to notice it, right? But that's the whole point of what he's doing. So what he's doing here is he's saying, look, you now can boldly draw near to the throne of grace. How shocking would that have sounded to Paul's audience in the first century? Would have been pretty shocking. Boldly draw near to the tabernacle? Their entire lives, they drew near to the temple with fear and trembling, I would think. Because I'm drawing near because I messed something up. I got to bring a sacrifice. I'm drawing near because God's so good to me and I'm not so good to him, so I need to come say thank you. Right? Offering of thanksgiving is what communion is. All right? Draw near to the throne of grace. You with confidence because of the work of your high priest. Not because of the confidence in you. Because of the confidence you have in the high priest, you can draw near. Does that make sense? I don't have confidence in me. I have confidence in the priest that I'm drawing near to. Because my priest his whole job is to draw me near to the Father. That's what priests do, right? Okay, that was the first slide. Good gracious. Chapter 5, verse 1. Y'all still with me? It's awful quiet in here tonight. For every high priest, then he's going to explain how this worked in the Torah. For every high priest chosen from among men is appointed to act on behalf of men in relation to God, to offer gifts and sacrifices for sin. So if anybody ever asks you, what does a priest do? You should ask one follow-up question. Do you mean a modern-day priest or a biblical priest? That's the first question you should ask. If they say a biblical priest, what does a biblical priest do? Take them to this passage and say, well, Paul seemed to think that what priests do is they act on behalf of men in relation to God to offer gifts and sacrifices for sins. That's what they do. Okay? Did Jesus do that? Not a trick question at all. A pretty easy one, actually. Yes, he acts on behalf of us in relation to God, in relationship. He's managing our relationship. And did Jesus offer gifts and sacrifices for sins? Yeah, he offered himself. He offered the greatest gift that God had back to him. Here you go. Here's my resurrected, indestructible life as a gift on behalf of men and women. That's what it is. And that's the sacrifice part, not the cross. The cross was the part where he died. It's when he presents himself to the throne of God in heaven, the sacrifice is done. I would love to talk about that more, but we're not going to have time to talk about everything. So look at this. So the high priest, it's his job to act on behalf of men in relation to God, offer gifts and sacrifices for sin. He can deal gently with the ignorant and the wayward, since he himself, the high priest, is beset with weakness. So remember, he's talking about the human Israelite high priest now. So he's saying, you know how this works, right? The high priest from Israel, chosen among men, appointed to do this and offer sacrifices. And he can deal gently with you. And he can even deal gently with like ignorant people and people that get off track, wayward, because even he has weaknesses, and even he can be ignorant, and even he can be wayward. So he can be gentle with you, right? That's how your pastor is supposed to be. He should be gentle with you because he himself should know about himself that he is beset with weaknesses. Yes? So that's why the priest is supposed to be your buddy, because he's supposed to get it. He gets you because he is you. But doesn't that also make him not enough? Because if he's a sinner just like me, then what can he really do for me? You see what Paul's doing here? Because of this, he is obligated to offer sacrifice for his own sins, just as he does for those of the people. If you go read Leviticus 16, the center of the Torah, the Day of Atonement, what does the high priest have to do first? He has to offer a bull for himself, for his own sins, to make sure himself is pure. And then he can go out and do the two-goat thing, right? And no one takes this honor for himself, but only when called by God, just as Aaron was. So let me go backwards a little bit. Why are we talking about this? Why is Paul talking about this? Because his audience is trying to figure out, how do we do this when the temple and the priesthood's still working? How is Jesus my high priest when there's a high priest down in Jerusalem right now that I thought was chosen and appointed by God? What do we do with that? So what he's doing is he's using everything they already understand, and he's saying, let me help you understand how this is going to work now. We're in a weird moment of history where we're in overlapping covenants. The old one is still functioning. The temple's still going on, but the new covenant has been inaugurated, and the old one's in this passing away phase, like an old man. That's the language he used. Okay, I'm not making fun of old people. I'm just saying that's what he said. Okay, nobody appoints himself to be high priest. So also, Christ did not exalt himself to be made high priest, but was appointed by him who said to him, Psalm 110, "You are my son, today I've begotten you." That was probably Psalm 2 there, right? So he's appointed by God. Christ didn't just show up on the scene, raised in Nazareth, and just decided, I think I'll be the high priest of the universe. You know, no, God chose him. God gave him this. And why does he need to? We already know that, but why does Paul need to say it? Because his audience is struggling with it. Aaron was picked by God himself, and everybody after Aaron had to be picked according to God's rules. And so who decided Jesus was a priest? He's from Judah. He's not even qualified. How does this work? Well, he didn't exalt himself, but God said, "You're my son, I've begotten you." And he says also in another place, Psalm 110, "You are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek." Oh, well, that clears it up. I could just imagine sitting in that audience, and it's probably because I spend way too much time studying this stuff, but I could just imagine sitting there and Paul saying that part and going, that didn't help me at all. Like, okay, I still got the same list of problems I had before you said that, right? You're a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. That's Psalm 110, which is also the psalm where it says, "You are my son," right? And I'm going to put all your enemies under your feet. All that's in Psalm 110. Now, the word order here in Greek, taxon, it means succession or sequence. Okay, so you're a priest forever. The Son of God is going to be a priest forever, meaning it never ends. There's no ending to this one. And he's going to be a priest in the succession of Melchizedek. And that makes this make sense. How? Well, let's keep reading. Let's see what happens. In the days of his flesh, Jesus, well, now we've changed subjects again. We've went to a different character. I'm trying to help y'all see that listening to Paul's sermons were just as hard as listening to mine. In the days of his flesh, Jesus offered up prayers and supplications. Man, that sounds very priest-like, doesn't it? Praying for people, going to God on behalf of others as supplication, asking for request. With loud cries and tears to him who is able to save him from death. So Jesus, in the days of his flesh, his earthly life, right? He prayed a lot with loud cries and tears to God who is able to save him from death. And Jesus was heard because of his reverence. Now stop right there for a minute. Jesus cried out a loud cry from the cross, didn't he? From the Psalms. My God, why have you forsaken me, right? Psalm 2, I can't remember which one that is. Loud cry, and it's a prayer. And he was heard because of his reverence. Right before he died. Do you get what I'm saying here? He hung on a cross. He prayed real loud. And God heard him. And then he died. That doesn't sound like saving him from death, does it? Well, no, unless you know the rest of the story. That actually that was the very thing he needed to do so that he could go defeat death by dying. That's why we call him God. Only God can figure out how to defeat death by dying himself. He's awesome, right? Nobody saw that coming. Nobody even knew it was possible. He's like, I know how we can get death. How are you going to do that? I'm going to die. Doesn't that mean you lose? Well, that's what everybody's going to think. Everybody, including death itself and Hades itself and Satan himself, is going to think they won. Because we let Satan think he had the power of death his entire existence. But I'm about to take it back. About to get the keys back. Right? So he was heard because of his reverence. And by the way, reverence there, me and Jimmy have been talking about this a lot. He's been studying the fear of God and how we tend to talk about the fear of God like reverence, respect, right? You heard this? I heard this a lot growing up. But fear of God doesn't mean to be afraid of him. It means like to have respect for him. There's only one problem with that definition, and that's the whole Bible. The entire Bible basically says, do what I say or else all these bad, horrible things will happen to you. And then it says, fear God. Sounds to me like you're supposed to be afraid of what happens if you go against him. It's pretty common sense. So he says he heard him because of his reverence. It literally is the word that's often translated as submission many, many times. So he was heard because he was submitted to God. He had already submitted. So when he cried out that prayer, he wasn't asking God to save him from that moment. That wasn't the plan. The plan is he wanted everybody to hear him quote that psalm. So everybody would read it 2,000 years later and understand what he was doing. He was doing what that psalm was prophesying. He came to save us. And he was heard because of his submission. Although he was a son, look at this. Jesus learned obedience through what he suffered. How does God in the flesh learn something? Good question, isn't it? You want to know the answer? I don't know. But that's what it says. It says that, and we see this in the Gospels, right? I mean, what is it, Luke something, where they lose Jesus in the temple when he's 12 years old? Everybody remembers that story, right? Every parent does, because we're like, oh, okay, I lost my kid in Walmart like 10 times, but Mary did it too, so it's fine, right? Where was I even going with this? I just lost my train of thought. I'm too tired. So we get that story when he gets lost in the temple, 12 years old, right? And they come back, and what's he doing? He's kind of being priesty, isn't he? He's teaching. He's like blowing the minds of all the rabbis. I love that story, right? But then they come back and they're like, "What are you doing?" He's like, "I'm about to be about my Father's business. I'm doing the family business." I've never read that passage and thought about his priesthood until this week. When I was studying this, and that story popped in my head, and I was like, "Well, that's kind of priesty." He's in the temple teaching people, right? Although he was a son, he learned obedience. So as in that story about him being left at the temple, we're told that he grew with favor with God and man. Now, I don't know how to explain what all that means. I just know that's what it says. And I'm called to follow him, which means I'm to be growing in favor with God and fellow man. Yes? So he learned obedience through what he suffered. Now, put some stuff in your notes here. Hebrews 2:9, we already studied this, that Jesus was crowned with glory and honor because of the suffering of death. So he's already talked about this before. Hebrews 2:10, it was fitting for God to make the founder of their salvation, that's Jesus, perfect through suffering. This will come up again in chapter 5, verse 9. Being made perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation to all who obey him. So we'll get to that verse in just a minute. So there's this idea that's being presented here that Jesus went ahead of us and showed us how to do it. He went and lived the example of what it looks like to be in obedience to God, to please God. Make sense? And then he says, follow me. Do what I did. That's what he's getting at here. We should be growing in our faith, following him, being like him, which means we learn obedience through what we suffer. We hardly ever think of suffering that way. We think of suffering as a problem that needs to be solved immediately. And I get it. When I'm suffering, that's what I'm praying for first. Solve this right now, please. But it might be that he's using that to prove something to you about him, or he's using it to prove something to you about you. Or he's using it to prove something about him to somebody else that you might not even know, but they're watching your life. God will use the suffering. That doesn't mean he causes it, but it certainly means he uses it. And being made perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation to all who obey him. Eternal, because remember, his priesthood is forever. He's not going to die and have to be replaced, because that's what Paul's audience is thinking about. Being designated by God a high priest after the order of Melchizedek. Let me go back to this and then we'll go to Melchizedek. He's the eternal source of salvation to all who obey him. Do I need to beat that horse again? Faithfulness, it's everywhere, right? All right, after the order of Melchizedek. So here's what we need to do. He's quoting, and he quoted earlier from Psalm 110 where Melchizedek comes up. So let's use the rest of our 8 minutes and 30 seconds to talk about Melchizedek. Now, we're not going to completely exhaustively talk about everything we need to talk about Melchizedek tonight, because that would be impossible. And he's going to keep coming up for the next few months. So we got plenty of time to work on this Melchizedek thing. All right. So this is the introduction. Okay. You ready? All right. Melchizedek is mentioned 2 times in the Old Testament. Genesis chapter 14, he's brought up, not explained at all, just tells you a little story about him and Abraham, and then goes on to something else. He's never brought up again in Genesis or any other book until Psalm 110, which Paul just quoted from a few verses ago. You're a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. And then after Psalms, he's not mentioned again. And the Old Testament ends. And then what we call the New Testament starts at Matthew, and he's not mentioned at all in Matthew or any of the New Testament books until you get to Hebrews. And then he's mentioned 8 times in 3 chapters. That should clue you in that there's something interesting here, because the Old Testament said basically nothing. And then all of a sudden, one book of the Bible, 3 chapters of it mentions him 8 times. Okay, this is going to be fun. So what is this Melchizedek thing? Well, let's go back to Genesis 14 and let's get the original story. All right, here we go. Genesis 14. After his return, this is previously there's been a big battle that went on between several kings, and Abraham's tied up in that because Abraham's trying to rescue Lot, who shouldn't even been there because Lot never should have been with Abraham to begin with, but that's a whole nother story. So this battle's over, and Abraham and his guys have won. And so anyway, verse 17. After his return from the defeat of Kedorlaomer, yes, that is how you say that, and the kings who were with him, the king of Sodom went out to meet him at the valley of Seve. That is the king's valley. And Melchizedek, king of Shalem, that's how you pronounce it, brought out bread and wine. Now all the Christians perk up, right? Bread and wine. Boy, that sounds really familiar, doesn't it? Bread and wine. It seems like there's a bread and wine thing at our church every Sunday at the end of the service, right? And we immediately read all that back into Genesis 14. Don't do that. Okay, I know that's fun and cool to think about. Nobody that Moses wrote this down for would have ever thought any of that. So just put a pause on that for now. Okay, let's read the Bible the right direction. You read it in the Old Testament, read forward, not backwards. So he brings out bread and wine. Because, here in parentheses, he was a priest of God Most High. He's a priest of El Elyon. And Melchizedek blessed him and said, Blessed be Abram by God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand. And Abram gave him 1/10 of everything. And that's it. That is the story of Melchizedek. And Paul's going to talk about Melchizedek and Jesus for 3 solid chapters based on that paragraph. What? What was Paul thinking? It seems like Paul must have had some more information about Melchizedek. And I know you're probably thinking, well, yeah, the Holy Spirit's telling him what to say and write. No, I'm saying, wonder if Paul had some documents we don't have. Wonder if Paul had ever read some of this, what we call Second Temple literature, the stuff in between the Testaments. Because there's a lot of people in those documents trying to figure out who Melchizedek is. He's all over the place. In the Dead Sea Scrolls, there's an entire scroll dedicated to Melchizedek. It's called 11Q. And I don't know if it ended up in your notes because I did it kind of last minute, but I went through some of that and looked into it. We're going to talk more about it in the future. But there's some really cool stuff in that scroll that sounds a lot like Jesus. Okay? So this is Melchizedek. Now his name means, it's a combination, which Hebrew names are like this. So Zedek means righteous or righteousness or justice. And all that means is the correct order of things. That's what righteousness and justice are about. Melchi is a form of malak, which is the word for king in Hebrew. So it's king of righteousness or righteous king. That's what his name means. Righteous king, king of righteousness. God, that just sounds real familiar, doesn't it? His name shall be called righteous king. Yeah, Isaiah 9. So that's what his name means. And he's a king of Shalem, which later, if you keep reading in the Bible, later Shalem comes up again, but it's called Yerushalem, Jerusalem. Melchizedek is a righteous king of ancient original Jerusalem. And he's a priest of God Most High. Now, everybody reading this after this story, that like way later after the Torah was written and all that stuff, right? They come back and read this story and they're going, well, that's weird because in the Torah, like the commandments about the priesthood, the high priest and the king can't be the same person. Matter of fact, there's a prophet, a priest, a king. And those have to be 3 different people. They can't be the same, right? So why is this guy a king and he's a priest of the Most High God? And hey, this is Genesis 14. There's no Torah covenant yet. There's no Leviticus or Exodus to go read about the priest and what he does and the requirements. Here's what I'm getting at. And this is what Hebrews is going to get at. There's another priesthood outside of Aaron and his descendants. And it existed before Aaron and his descendants ever existed. That's what he's setting up right now that he's going to keep messing with for like 3 chapters. Because here's what he wants to do. His audience, Paul's audience, knows Jesus is not qualified to be the high priest because he's from the tribe of Judah. He can't be the high priest. So how, Paul, are you telling us he's our high priest? Paul says, I got this funny story. Way back in Abraham's day, remember that strange king of righteousness of Shalem that just shows up out of nowhere and he's a priest of the Most High God before there are any priests of the Most High God, we thought? And where's he priesting at? There's no tabernacle. He's an itinerant preacher? Is he a revival preacher? What is he? Paul's saying, remember that mysterious thing that we've kind of all sat around and wondered about and had Bible studies and argued about? You know, remember that guy? Yeah. Well, doesn't that passage prove there's a priesthood outside of the Israelite priesthood? To which his audience will be going, well, yeah. Yeah, that's the priesthood that Jesus is leading. So do you see what he's doing? That was a long way to set that up, but what he's doing here is he's trying to set them up to say, no. not everything's about Israel and that one covenant. God has been doing things outside of that all along. Before it, during it, and he's going to keep doing things after it. So remember, he's talking to Jews. They tend to get really hung up on their thing. So he's saying, it's not just about you, it's about all the nations. God wants everybody. So Jesus is going to be our high priest over all the nations, not just one little nation in the Middle East. Make sense? I hope. And the 10th of everything, let me just hit this real quick and then I'll stop talking. A lot of people love to run to this as like their support that tithing was before the Torah covenant, right? I used to do that too. That's why I'm making fun of it. Not the best way to do that. First of all, this is a one-time gift. So I would not use this to preach about tithing. You're going to sink your church's finances. Because, if it's just one time, I'm just going to tithe once and be done. Right? So this is not a passage to go to try to make an argument for tithing. Tithing in the Torah is more than 10%. Just go read it. Just pay real close attention. They add up. There's more than one tithe. Okay, there's several of them. So I don't want to do a whole sermon about tithing. I'm just trying to let you know, please don't make the mistake of going to this and saying, see, this is why you have to do it. This was a one-time thing. All right? This was not what we call tithing. Bread and wine. I'm going to work more on that. I think there's more to it. I hadn't found it yet, but I've got a sense. I've got this little nagging feeling. There's some stuff to find there, and I'll work on that. But here's what I do know. What's going on here at a basic level, if you take bread and wine out and just say chips and salsa, that was the common way of greeting someone who was a priest or a delegate of some government or anything like that. This is what you did. Eastern cultures are very much into hospitality. It is a high virtue in their culture. Even Muslims are like this. If you go over to a Muslim country right now, as long as they're not shooting each other, and you go by someone's house, they will be hospitable to you because it is a virtue for them. Even if you say, I'm a Christian, I'm a believer in Jesus Christ, I'm your sworn enemy, they still will feed you and be kind to you because their religion tells them to. And our religion tells us to. Right? So that's what's going on here. He's just saying, you're a priest of my God? I often wonder if Abraham was surprised. Because the way his story reads is Abraham's just chilling out in Babylon, worshiping whatever gods they're worshiping, and Yahweh comes to him and goes, I got a place for you to go. And in that journey along the way, he runs into this guy. I'd have been shocked. Like, you're a priest of that God that's been leading me around? I'm going to hang out with you. But he just gives him a gift, and then he won't take anything from the other kings, and the story just moves on. But what Paul's trying to do here is he's saying, remember that weird thing? There's a priesthood that preceded the priesthood you're obsessed with, and I'm telling you the priesthood that came before the Israelite priesthood is the one Jesus is leading now. And it's better because the promises are better. The land he's taken us to is better. Everything's better. And he is the word. He's not just giving you the word. He is the word itself. You can't get any better than that. If you walk away from that, you don't end up better off. All right, next week, we're going to hit chapter 5, verse 11. And we'll go through chapter 12, chapter 6, verse 12. Probably not, but that's how much I'm going to try to pull off, but we'll see. So read that, make any observations that you find when you're studying it, bring your questions, and that's what we'll cover next time.